special edition of Inside the Huddle right here on High School Cube News, brought to you by Danley's Garage Builders. My name is Brian Chimino with you once again. Mike Clark of the Sun-Times, and joined special today with Steve Soucie of the Kankakee Journal as Christmas come early for high school football fans. Playoff pairings announced this past Saturday night, and we're going to run down some of the big ones and possible matchups to look forward to in the state of Illinois. So let's start off with Class 8A, the number one overall seed despite their loss to St. Rita this past weekend. Number one is Loyola Academy, and they'll be facing Niles and Notre Dame, which is kind of spinning the wheels a little bit.
Yeah, that's kind of an interesting matchup. I mean, one of the things that John Holisek, the Loyola coach, told me last night is it was kind of an odd situation because they knew that they were pretty much locked into that one seed no matter what happened last night. So they did have the Catholic League Blue outright or shared championship at stake, but really, you know, that's not their main goal this year. Their main goal is to win a state title, which they haven't done for a while, even though they've gone deep into the playoffs the last several years. So Notre Dame, you know, another interesting test for Loyola's defense with Chris James, who's one of the top running backs in the state. You know, that's one thing that kind of jumps out on the top half of the bracket. You know, Barrington is the number 2 seed there. Only loss was to Schaumburg. So, I mean, you know, if seeds play out, that would be a semifinal. But the team you got to look for, I think, is Glenbard North. You know, when you get into November, with the weather being bad, if you've got a good defense and a good running game, you're going to be in pretty good shape. Glenbard North has the best player in the state in Justin Jackson. He's got over 1,200 yards, I want to say, in the last, well, actually over 1,100 yards in the last 3 weeks. He's got well over 30 touchdowns. You know, he is clearly the best player of the state. He's a two-way player, too. So, I mean, them as a number 3 seed, if you were seeding this, you know, using some kind of computer projection, they would probably not be the number 3 seed. So the top half of the bracket looks kind of tough there.
Steve, what do you think about the top half there?
Well, I look at that bracket and I look at the potential second-round matchup between Glenbard North that you just mentioned and a Stevenson team that I think is playing really well down the stretch as well. You could have that already early on, and like you said, if this was not a mathematical formula that put these two teams in the bracket, I doubt you would have a third-seeded Glenbard North and a 6th-seeded Stevenson in the top half of a 16-team bracket, but that's the way it will probably play out.
On the bottom half, you've got a couple of Southwest Suburban Blue teams. Homewood Flossmoor is in the bottom quad of the bowling half. Bolingbrook is in the top half of that bracket. And they played an overtime game earlier this season. Wouldn't surprise a lot of people, I'm sure, to see them match up again, and that could be another great game.
Steve, anything catch your eye on the South bracket?
Well, I like where Neuqua Valley is in the bracket. I think they have a pretty nice road for them to possibly set themselves up with a game there with Homewood Flossmoor a little bit deeper down the line. I think that would be an interesting contest when you look at it. But as a whole, I think that bracket is a little bit top-heavy.
So let's move on down to Class 7A, another team that lost their first game of the season this past Friday, the Lake Zurich Bears, but they still get the number 1 seed in the top half of the bracket. They'll be hosting Elk Grove.
Yeah, I guess the big news here, obviously, is that Mount Carmel, the defending 8A champ, dropped to 7A this year. We kind of thought that was going to happen. It did happen. They're actually in the bottom half of the bracket as a number 2 seed behind Whitney Young, which is 9-0 out of one of the Chicago sections as the number 1 seed. In a quad, actually, there's 2 quads in the south for 7A. Edwardsville is also a number 1 seed in a quad. You know, certainly on the top half, Lake Zurich, you know, is a team to be reckoned with. I mean, even though they did give up 21 points, or 27 points, I believe, to Stevenson this past weekend, they certainly got a great defense. Interesting possible quarterfinal matchup there with Wheaton North and their quarterback Clayton Thorson. You know, again, on the bottom half, you have to feel like Mount Carmel is sitting in pretty good shape there. We don't know too much up here about Edwardsville. You know, they've dominated the Metro East. They're the best team down there, although they only beat East St. Louis 29-28. So, you know, kind of hard to tell exactly how good they are compared with the rest of the state.
When I look at the South bracket, the interesting thing to me was how they were going to move those chess pieces around in terms of who they were going to put in each quad. When you look at it and you look at it on paper, I think you're looking at one quad that's significantly stronger than the other one down in the bottom bracket. You've got Wheaton Warrenville down there. You've got Mount Carmel. You've got St. Rita. despite the fact that they obviously have kind of a weak number one there with the public league's Whitney Young at 9-0. But that other bracket doesn't look nearly as deep. There aren't nearly as many compelling second-round matchups there. So I think there's a little bit of an inequity in the bottom of that bracket.
Yeah, the other interesting thing about the bottom half of that bracket, you got two first-time qualifiers, Plainfield East and Oswego East, never been to the playoffs before. So that's going to be interesting to see how they fare. And then obviously Lincoln Way East, who was the runner-up in 7A last year, got a couple of losses this year in conference, which hasn't happened for a while, but they're always a dangerous team too.
Let's move on down to Class 6A, where the top seed in the northern half of the bracket is the usual suspect, Rockford Boylan, 9-0. They'll be hosting Belvedere North in the first round.
Yeah, that's a conference matchup, and of course, it's always hard to tell about the NIC 10 teams because it's a closed league, as we say. They don't play anybody else outside of their conference ever. Boylan has earned a little bit of the benefit of the doubt over the years because they've obviously gone deep into the playoffs. You know, again, we're going to find out exactly how good they are once they start playing outside of that conference. A team that I think is maybe one to watch in that top half of the bracket is Cary Grove. They've got a history of playoff success. They're playing pretty well lately. They're only 6-3 this year, but they seem to have been coming on a little bit in the last few weeks. Other than that, the other team that I look at is Batavia. They beat Glenbard North in week 1, which is a huge quality win. Their only loss was to Richards in week 4, I believe. They've got a lot of offensive weapons. This could be their year. You know, they've got a lot of incentive too. They were 9-0 last year, lost in the first round of the playoffs. So Batavia could be a team to watch, I think.
And another interesting fact about Batavia is they are the largest school in the 6A field. They had spent most of the time speculated that they'd be in the Class 7A playoffs. And some moves last night, including New Trier's victory and some other things that happened, pushed Batavia right into the back end of that 6A field when all along most people were thinking they were going to end up in the 7A tournament.
Kind of looking at the south side of that 6A bracket, number 1 seed is Richards after a couple of the number 1 seeds. Richards 8-1, and also Crete Monet down there at 8-1 as well.
Yeah, I mean, the interesting thing that jumps out at me is that we could have a Richards-Batavia rematch in the final. That's assuming that Richards can get past Crete Monet, which is the defending state champ. Crete's been kind of an interesting story this year. The defense has been very good. Their only loss was to Bennett when they gave up 35 points, but actually only gave up, I want to say, 1 offensive touchdown. So they gave up 5 field goals in that game to Bennett's kicker, John Duvick, who's the best kicker in the state. But, you know, Crete and Richards are certainly the teams that jump out on that side of the bracket. Also, a lot of people like Rock Island, especially out in the western part of the state. We don't know an awful lot about them here, but you know they're sitting at a 4 seed, and also Normal Community, Normal West. Normal Community beat Normal West, so it's kind of hard for us to judge some of those teams from downstate. But you know, I kind of like Crete and Richards in a semifinal there, maybe with the winner seeing Batavia in the final.
The fun thing about that bracket for me was how it came down to the last game in the state of Illinois. That whole bracket could have been different if Rich Central would have won that game in overtime today against Crete. The whole thing would have changed it around. Crete would have dropped a couple of seeds. Others would have moved up. Obviously, Rich Central's position on the top part of that bracket would have changed as well. So the fact that that all came down to the one last game had a whole heck of a lot of effect on the 6A bracket, and a lot of people don't even realize it.
To look on down to Class 5A, Montini, the 4-time defending champions, number 1 seed at 9-0. They'll be hosting Morgan Park.
Yeah, top half of the 5A bracket is ridiculous. I don't think there's any other way of putting that. Montini is the 4-time defending champs. You have Joliet Catholic, only loss 8-1 with their only loss 22-21 to St. Patrick, and they've got a running back named Mike Ivla who is having a ridiculous year. He's around 2,000 yards right now. You have Caneland, whose only loss was to Sycamore. Sycamore is also in this bracket. You've got probably the best public league hopeful in Brooks, and they're a 7 seed at 8-1. Their only loss was to Geneseo, which is another team that's got a chance to do something as well. Lincoln Way West, only loss was to Sycamore. Whoever comes out of the top half of 5A is going to be playing some pretty tough games.
Yeah, that top of the bracket was really interesting. And I was watching this develop over the last couple of weeks, and there's a clean geographic split between the north and the south here, which is very rare to begin with. You don't have Joliet Catholic in the past has had to go south. Some other teams have had to go south to fill out that bracket. But there's an absolute clean line between north and south here. And as I was watching it develop, it seemed to me that it was going to be very important who won that Sycamore-Canelan game for seeding, and that's exactly how it played out, because Sycamore, by winning that game, gets the 2 seed and a little bit easier bracket on their half, because you've got Montini, you've got Joliet Catholic, and you've got Canelan all sitting in one 8-team grouping up there, and Sycamore's got a little bit easier road down on the bottom, and they got it because they won that game over Canelan.
Before we wrap the show up, we're going to take a brief look at Class 4A. Evergreen Park's had a great year. They've been in the top 25 pretty much halfway through the season. 9-0, number 1 seed, hosting Richmond-Burton.
Yeah, historically that's kind of an interesting matchup, because Richmond-Burton, we recall from a few years ago, played in probably one of the most entertaining title games that I've seen when they played against Rochester. Almost won that game. Don't think they've got quite that kind of a team this year. Evergreen Park, they've surprised a lot of people. They beat Richards, which was a huge win for them. It's going to be interesting to see in these playoffs. They've been to the quarterfinals 2 years ago, to the semifinals last year. This is the year that they feel like they can definitely win it. They've got a lot of weapons on offense. They lost their starting quarterback to an injury. The backup has come in and has been remarkable in replacing him. So, that's a team certainly to watch. Otherwise, there's some other teams in here that maybe aren't, quite as strong in terms of strength of schedule. So this could be a pretty good year for Evergreen Park, I'm thinking.
Yeah, that North bracket has been something that's been questioned a little bit because of the presence of a lot of public league schools in that bracket. I know there are a lot of teams in the South bracket. They're pretty close to that line. We're hoping that they'd find their way into that bracket. But when I look at it, I don't think they necessarily want all that much to do with Evergreen Park either, to be honest with you. I think they're easily one of the best teams in this class. And should it end up being another one of those situations where Rochester runs through the south portion of the bracket, which a lot of people seem to think might happen, I think that would be a very interesting final if it materializes that way.
So it seems like it was just week 1 last week, and Mother Nature was postponing and delaying games. But this Friday, we're kicking off round 1 of the IHSA football playoffs all over the state of Illinois. That'll do it for this special edition of Inside the Huddle here on High School Cube News, brought to you by Danley's Garage Builders. My name is Brian Chimino, Mike Clark, and Steve Soucie sitting in. Tune in next week for a new edition of Inside the Huddle, along with another edition of Beth Long's MVP segment. We'll see you guys next week.